everyone, and welcome to Resistance Live for the 3rd of June, 2025. We have breaking news that just hit within the last half an hour. Very significant news out of Newark, New Jersey, which is that Ras Baraka, who is currently also running for governor, early voting starts today, New Jersey, get out there and vote, has now filed suit against Alina Habba and the senior Department of Homeland Security official on site on the day that he was arrested for doing his job at the Delaney Detention Center, which is, of course, an ICE facility that was shut down until Trump came back into office and has since been reopened, and over which Ras Baraka has oversight authority as the Newark mayor. This is a very big deal. And having quickly reviewed the complaint, I want to tell you all that it's quite significant. I mean, one of the things that I will just tell you that I find really fascinating about this particular complaint is that in addition to the fact that it alleges false arrest and malicious prosecution against Alina Habba and this fellow Ricky Patel, no relation to Cash, is that he also asserts defamation claims under state law against Alina Habba for all the statements that she made on Fox News on the day of the arrest. And I will just tell you that reviewing what's cited in the complaint, all the things that he said about how Ras Baraka and my rep, LaMonica McIver, and others who were on site charged at the Delaney Detention Center, attempted to invade it, all these things that are obviously false when you look at the footage in relation to what happened that day. All of those statements are defamatory. And he has alleged an unspecified amount of compensatory damages, which if you've been here for a while, you know what that means is that those damages are designed to compensate him for the harm that he suffered as a result of this, both reputationally, physically, and emotionally, and also unspecified punitive damages. Now, what makes this very interesting is this case is filed in the district court for the District of New Jersey, where just a couple of weeks ago, we had a judge reprimand Alina Habba for acting outside the scope of her role as the interim U.S. attorney for the District of New Jersey. So we already have judges kind of lined up in this district, which, by the way, tends to tilt relatively left, to chastise Alina Habba for acting outside the scope of her authority. And now we have this incredibly well-drafted complaint by Ras Baraka, against whom, by the way, charges were dropped by Alina Habba on the same day that she indicted LaMonica McIver, claiming that Alina Habba's actions violated federal and state law. This is one to watch. And I will just tell you that Ras Baraka is getting my vote for the governor of New Jersey. I personally think he's a real fighter. He also has an incredible platform that is deeply progressive in terms of housing equality and other issues. As the mayor of Newark, he's done an incredible job on a whole host of fronts. And so this is absolutely a really interesting development. And it's also a very deep indicator that if he is elected as the governor of New Jersey, we're just in primary season now, and it's just the primary elections that are happening starting today. If he is elected the governor of New Jersey, it's really clear that he's going to be a serious fighter. And so this is a very significant development this morning, and not the only significant court development that we have going on in the last couple of days. Okay, so we have new pleadings filed in the Kilmar-Abrego-Garcia case that essentially are scathing at the willingness of the DOJ under Trump to completely ignore what are now 3 orders finding that the DOJ's jurisdictional argument, namely that if someone's removed from the country, they don't have any obligation and that the federal courts can't order them to return him. 3 courts have now found that argument to be false, and they're continuing to make it anyway. On top of that, the DOJ hasn't really changed its tune on any of this and has made no effort essentially to try to get him returned. So that is one of 3 cases now where contempt proceedings have been teed up in front of a federal judge. And we have seen in the last week or so a growing outrage from the bench at the DOJ's attempt to obfuscate their responsibilities to the courts. So lots of dominoes lining up right now. And I'm just going to tell you, I know there are lots of people out there who say well, when is it going to happen? Why hasn't it happened yet? Well, I have to remind you all that there are evidentiary stages to this, or it won't hold up on appeal. And also, there have to be requests for contempt of court in certain circumstances. So this is a situation where, with Kilmar Abrego Garcia and various other instances as well, like, for instance, the flight that we talked about last week that took off for Djibouti, wasn't actually destined for Djibouti, but that's where it ended up, and then it turned around and flew back. After a temporary restraining order was issued saying that those folks could not be deported. So, and that judge was really angry. So there's a whole series now of potentials for contempt lining up. And that's really, really, really good news. In other legal news, very significant. This one kind of made me laugh. Over the weekend, Trump attacked Leonard Leo and the Federalist Society. This morning, in relation to this same story, there was a breaking news story on CNN about Trump being essentially disgusted with his own Supreme Court nominees from the first term, but most especially Amy Coney Barrett, who, as we know, has been, even though she votes 80% of the time with the conservative branch of the Supreme Court, has been more of a swing vote on some of these cases than I think most people would have expected. Of course, one of the things to remember here is that the Federalist Society, through Leonard Leo and Harlan Crow, have packed the courts under conservative presidents with their particular designees, and particularly in Trump 1, had a very significant role to play in terms of determining who Trump was going to nominate to the bench. So now apparently, because there are judges, including Supreme Court justices, who are not just like upholding everything that Trump wants to do as constitutional or lawful, he's decided that he's not taking any more recommendations from the Federalist Society. And Stephen Miller went on the news shows this weekend and ranted about this and how they weren't going to take any more recommendations from the Federalist Society. I don't know. It's another leopards eating faces kind of moment, to be very candid about it. Because, you know, these are folks who have been in bed with Trump and with MAGA from the very beginning. And now, as usual, Trump has decided that they're not loyal enough. So someone asked a question on the Patreon feed this morning about what this could potentially mean for future judicial nominations. So let me make a couple of things really clear here. We don't know how much of this is actually legit, right? Because one of the things that's really clear is that most people who have been nominated for federal judgeships, not all, but most, under Trump, one, have been vetted, and actually, honestly, since January, have been vetted by and approved by the Federalist Society. So how is Trump planning on vetting judicial nominees? Well, we have some indications because of how they staff for Project 2025, which is that presumably there will be some kind of loyalty test that goes along with this for anybody who wants to be a federal judge. Now, the problem with that is that Amy Coney Barrett, of course, among others, had extensive interviews with the Trump administration before she was put up as a nominee for the Supreme Court. And presumably, she said all the things that they wanted to hear at the time. So this is all a sort of interesting devolution of how judges are going to get pushed to the federal bench. And the other thing I have to remind you all of is that no judicial nomination is complete without a confirmation hearing in the Senate. And while the Republicans currently control the Senate, there is plenty of room to push if, say, Trump nominates someone, as he did in his first term, who's literally never tried a case. And again, I have to remind you all that this is a place where we're going to have to handle some leverage, because we need to make sure that these lifetime appointments are not packed with like crazy people. So again, eyes up on this one, but it was really interesting to watch. And I have to say, you know, yes, it was my weekend dose of Schadenfreude. Okay. We have to talk about ICE for a couple of moments again. So the latest strategy from ICE, after some breaking news over the weekend that Miller and Patel and others had been just randomly demanding that ICE arrest 3,000 people a day, we have this new strategy that has started coming up in the last week, where essentially ICE shows up at a courthouse, an immigration judge, who, by the way, is appointed by the executive branch. They are not appointed in the same means as federal judges, dismisses the case. That results in an immediate attempt at deportation, and ICE will arrest those people as they step out of court. We're going to talk about like wildly amoral. On top of it, it's also like deeply violative of due process, because there are supposed to be means by which you have a right to appeal from an immigration decision. Okay. This is one thing that we have seen now just ramping up, and you've seen footage of this inside, for instance, the courthouse at Foley Square in downtown New York City, where, by the way, not unrelatedly, Jerry Nadler's offices are located. So late last week, we had this incident where ICE was on site, randomly arresting people as they left immigration hearings, which, by the way, they are lawfully obligated to show up for if they have a pending asylum claim or are pending legal status. Essentially, this is like entrapment, what ICE is doing. On that particular day, what happened was that a few Department of Homeland Security officers got it into their heads that Jerry Nadler's office staff were hiding people who were here who were undocumented. And they stormed into Jerry Nadler's office, put one of Nadler's staffers, in handcuffs. There's video footage of all of this, of her crying and screaming, and then attempted to gain access to a private area of Jerry Nadler's offices. Now, the staffer was since released. She wasn't actually arrested. She was just detained. But this was an attempt at a show of force, right? To try to say, again, to Democratic lawmakers, and this lines up with something else that we've already talked about here in the context of the prosecution of LaMonica McIver, to try to say to Democratic Party officials, electeds, that if they stand up to ICE or the Department of Homeland Security, they're going to be harassed, potentially arrested, and maybe prosecuted. And again, this is an attempt to silence those in the Democratic Party who may potentially be speaking out or acting in opposition to ICE. So yes, it is thuggery. There's like kind of no question about it, but there are some very positive developments on this front that we have to talk about in conjunction with this, because I am taking a lot of hope actually from some of what we've seen in terms of community response in the last few days. Okay, so many of you by now have probably seen the footage of the raid on the restaurant in San Diego over the weekend, where ICE stormed into a restaurant, put every single person working in that restaurant in handcuffs, and then took away several employees. And this is a very well-known restaurant in this neighborhood in San Diego. What happened immediately was that the neighborhood came out and people started screaming at ICE and telling them to get out and telling them that what they were doing was Nazi stuff, and, really responding immediately, just like completely instantaneous protest against the invasion of this local eatery by ICE. And the end result of that is that ICE had to use flash bombs and tear gas to even get out of the neighborhood. Now, some have used this footage as a claim that, oh my God, we're in a police state. But I have to say that I agree with some other commentators online, including people like Kelly Hayes, who have pointed out that what this is actually showing is that there is so much pushback against what ICE is doing that local communities are mobilizing in like 2 minutes, and that that ICE is being forced to use military-style tactics to even do their jobs. And actually, in many ways, this is a positive development, okay? Because a much worse development would be, for instance, neighbors standing by while people are carted off and letting ICE do what they're doing and being like good Germans. That's not what happened in San Diego. It's also not what happened in Massachusetts over the weekend, where there was an event where ICE literally was pushed essentially by a wall of people out of that neighborhood and stopped from detaining people. Like, there's literally footage of them getting in vans and basically running away. So again, I want to remind you all that it's a really important moment to have a clear lens about what's happening, to not just post stuff about like flash bombs and tear gas, like, oh my God, the horror, it's a police state, but to make the point that the reason why they had to do that was because average everyday people were standing up against these fascist Gestapo tactics. It's really good, actually, that they are being forced to do that kind of stuff in order to carry out these random 3,000 arrests daily, okay? That people are literally saying, no, you will not do this in our neighborhood. Or if you try it, you're going to hear from us. Again, I'm taking a lot of hope right now in the community resistance related to this. And I think it's a really positive development, because the other thing I'll just say here is that in case you missed it, the New Republic did an interview with the mother who was the subject of the New York Times piece, who was arrested in Iowa after living in the United States for like 20 years. And it's a really moving piece because it's in her own words how she wants to go home to her family, how, this is her community and her home, about how, she's built relationships with people in the community who have provided her safety. And as you may remember from the New York Times piece last week, there's kind of a really big cognitive dissonance happening in that town about this beloved community member's detention, where people who voted for Trump are like, I didn't vote for this. And, I have to say there's been a lot of online discourse over the weekend about like, yes, you did vote for this. Well, that's true. They did vote for that, whether they knew it or not. But simultaneously, I'm just going to say something here for fellow organizers, because I think this is really important. All right. Responding to people who are having a moment of cognitive dissonance where they're like, I didn't think this was going to happen, and not taking into account the fact that they were purposefully targeted on social media, that they were fed a stream of disinformation about what Trump's immigration policies were going to look like, and that they were, in some instances at least, conned. I'm separating out from this the far-right white supremacists with the neo-Nazi tattoos who know exactly what they're doing, right? But that average, everyday American citizens were fed a soup of disinformation and propaganda that told them that we were being invaded and that gang members were only going to be detained and removed. And they bought that. Okay. And I'm not excusing any of the racism on the right-hand side, the right side of the fence, the far right side of the fence at all. But I want people to understand that when someone comes to you and says, I didn't vote for this, what they're actually saying is, this doesn't line up with my values. What is happening right now doesn't line up with my values. And that's an opportunity that we shouldn't waste, because that's the cognitive dissonance that needs to be like watered and cultivated so that that person can then have a space to emerge in a form of resistance. All right. So really critical right now to see it through that lens. And I will just say that there are more and more stories like this coming out across the country. And the latest polling, at least, take it for what it's worth, you all know how I feel about polling, shows that like the vast majority of America does not like what Trump is doing from an immigration standpoint, does not like what ICE is doing. And, I'll just say this is another opportunity to understand that when you arm law enforcement to the teeth with like military style riot gear, what you end up with is a culture of oppression that is empowered in this way. Because local law enforcement are also in some instances working with ICE. Although I will say we had another really good story about this where public pressure in a New England town caused that town to back away from its agreement with ICE to cooperate. So they're now getting no local law enforcement help in that town. And we need more of that too. So it's really critical that we understand that there's an opening happening right now, right? And that has a lot of potential attached to it if it's managed properly, okay? All right, that's that. Okay, talked about that. All right, we have to talk about the absolutely despicable attack in Colorado this weekend, where someone threw Molotov cocktails into a protest designed to support the hostages as a result of the October 7th Hamas attack. Absolutely just despicable, horrific attack. And I want to point out that one of the things that's been really great in the aftermath of that is seeing everyone coming together, including folks who are pro-Palestinian, and making statements about how this hateful anti-Semitic violence has to end. Particularly, I want to point out that there have been a number of folks, including Jewish folks, who have been, very deeply outspoken against what's happening in Palestine and in the Gaza Strip, making a point of pointing out the importance of also standing up against anti-Semitism, violent anti-Semitism like this. And I've also seen quite a number of folks who have been very outspoken on all fronts, condemning these attacks. And so it's really critical to understand that there is anti-Semitic violence on the rise here. And there is a distinction to be made. This is very important, between the policies of the state of Israel right now and the Jewish people, who are, not a monolith. Not everybody is behind what Israel is doing. And I think in part and in whole, actually, we have to very strongly stand up against anti-Semitism right now in the way in which it's growing. So especially inside the United States, and that confusion of what Netanyahu's government is doing versus individual Jewish people is truly problematic right now. So again, this person has been arrested. They have been charged with a hate crime. And we're going to have to see how that case develops. But truly horrifying, just absolutely horrifying attack. Okay, the Supreme Court, one more bit of really good news. The Supreme Court, and there was some confusion about this on social media, which I didn't really understand. I think people are used to getting so much bad news out of the Supreme Court that this one caused some confusion in the public domain. So one of the things that I want folks to understand is that every once in a while, the Supreme Court declines to hear, well, not every once in a while, quite frequently, like the vast majority of cases, the Supreme Court declines to take an appeal. They will deny what's called a writ of certiorari and refuse to take up a case, because the cases that the Supreme Court takes are like within their own discretion. They do not hear every appeal. But in instances where they just flat out deny a writ of certiorari and say, we're not going to hear this case, the lower court decision stands. And so there was a decision yesterday, very important and significant decision, where the Supreme Court denied certiorari on a Second Amendment challenge to a Maryland law that banned semi-automatic rifles like an AR-15 after Sandy Hook. What that means is that the lower court's determination that that law was constitutional, meaning the ban could stay in effect, stands. And this is actually like a really fascinating development given the makeup of the court, because what it does essentially is say that there weren't enough justices to challenge this ban to have the case heard by the court. Again, really interesting. There's a lot of tea leaf reading going on about this, but it's very good news for Maryland. And it's very good news generally, because if you're going to read the tea leaves, one of the things that it might indicate is there's not a majority on the Supreme Court right now that would overturn an assault weapons ban. And I personally think that's actually great. So again, I'm not sure why people were so confused by that, but it's very significant, like very, very significant. And again, tea leaf reading, a little bit of speculation there, but nonetheless, extremely important development. Okay. One final note for today. We are now, again, longtime followers know this, deep in Supreme Court decision-making territory. So all the most significant decisions in the Supreme Court's term, which one's from October to June, generally come in the month of June and often in the latter half of June. And if they're not wholly complete, they run up until about the 4th of July. We are waiting on some very significant rulings this term. I have a few that I'm keeping an eye on. One, of course, has to do with the case that was brilliantly argued by Chase Strangio about trans rights and medical care. That is something that we are waiting on right now in particular, but there were a whole series of very significant cases this term. And all of those decisions are going to come sometime in the next 4 to 5 weeks. So, buckle up is what I have to say about that. It's going to be an interesting run this year, particularly with regard to where I was earlier in the broadcast, namely, like, is the conservative coalition on the Supreme Court going to hold together? And I think there are some very big question marks about that, to be honest. I think this is going to be a really interesting moment to read where Amy Coney Barrett is going to land on some of this stuff. And I will just say that in relation to what I was talking about earlier, namely Trump's apparently rampant criticism of Amy Coney Barrett, it was not limited just to her. He actually had some choice words for Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. So he's not happy about that. And who knows whether or not that will actually play out in real time in terms of what's going to happen in these decisions. But we're in that season again. And I'm going to remind everybody, of course, that I will be here with live analysis of all of those decisions as they come down. I think that, as always, we can expect Thomas and Alito to do the worst possible thing, but everybody else's vote is kind of up in the air. And I will also just add that we have yet to see how they're going to rule on not just some cases involving significant social and constitutional issues, but also they've got a mountain of emergency appeals in front of them right now from the Trump administration with regard to some of these cases where temporary restraining orders or preliminary injunctions have been issued against Trump policies and EOs. So it's going to be a really wild June on the courtroom front. And I trust that you will all be here for all of that analysis. Okay. Final note for today that I just wanted to mention. The video that we did a week ago yesterday on stealth activism has gone like wildly viral. I think as of this morning, it had like 130,000 views or something along those lines. I'm really grateful for all the positive feedback on that video. We understand as a result that there seems to be a real interest in talking about how stealth activism can work in this moment. So we are going to do a free webinar sometime in the next 2 weeks. Stay tuned for an announcement on that, about stealth activism particularly. And that will be an hour-long webinar. It'll be totally free. And we'll do that off the usual schedule of the broadcast. So I think it's going to be like on a Monday, but we'll see about that. So that'll give everybody an opportunity to get a much deeper dive into what it looks like in this era. And also how it's playing out, because we have a lot of folks that we're working with inside the Ripple Effect Institute who are actually engaged in this on a daily basis. We have a lot of real world examples. Of course, I'm going to anonymize them, but of folks who are really making tremendous differences where they live in their own communities and even nationwide, whose names you will never know. And so I really want to just encourage you all to stay tuned for that. We'll make an announcement about that when it's coming. I know our past webinars people have really enjoyed, so I'm looking forward to this one. And of course, if you like what we're doing here, hit that thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. Drop me a comment if you're watching on the replay to tell the algorithm that you like what we're doing. And I will remind you all that our starter guide on how to lead change without burning out is available. The downloadable link is going to be in the comments. And also, if you want to know more about the Ripple Effect Institute, you can apply for a free strategy call. The link to do that is in the show notes. And we will talk about where you are on your journey as an activist or a leader and whether or not the Ripple Effect Institute is right for you. And I see some of our Ripple Effect Institute members are here in the comments today. So thank you for being here, friends. All right, that's it, everybody. I will catch you all here tomorrow live at regular time. Have a good rest of your Tuesday. Hang in there, people. All right, bye.